December 1944, Western Europe, a frozen road disappears into fog, bordered by hedgerows, stripped bare by winter and shellfire. Somewhere beyond the mist, German forward observers scan the quiet with binoculars, waiting for movement that fits a pattern they understand. Then something rolls into view. It is small, light, open-topped, a Willys Jeep, the most familiar Allied vehicle on the front. But mounted on its frame is a gun that does not belong there. Too large, too heavy. A weapon meant for tanks or fixed mounts, not for a machine built to carry radios and officers. The Jeep stops. The barrel remains still. German observers do not fire. They hesitate. This is wrong in a way that feels intentional. The Allies do not waste anti-tank weapons like this. They do not expose guns without support. When something appears that breaks doctrine so completely, it usually means something else is hidden infantry armor, an ambush waiting for the first shot. Minutes pass. Orders are delayed. The road remains quiet. On the other side of the fog, American soldiers wait as well, watching the effect of their creation, not knowing yet whether it will draw fire, invite destruction, or achieve something far more valuable. Time stretches, and in that hesitation born, not of firepower, but of doubt, the battlefield shifts to understand why this single, improvised vehicle triggered such caution, and why German forces reacted the way they did. We must step back into the pressures of late-war Europe, where shortages, improvisation, and fear of deception shaped every decision. By the winter of 1944, the Western Front no longer resembled the clean arrows and schedules drawn on maps in the summer after Normandy. The advance had outrun its plans. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts lagged behind. Units fought where they stood, not where doctrines preferred them to be. American forces were winning, but they were stretched tank destroyer battalions, originally designed to counter massed German armor, found themselves dispersed under strength, or absent when needed most. Anti-tank guns were available, but mobility was limited. Roads were cratered. Tracked vehicles bogged down in mud or snow. Towed guns were effective only if they arrived in time, and often they did not. This environment rewarded adaptation. The U.S. Army had entered the war with a culture that tolerated field modification, not officially celebrated, but quietly accepted. If something worked and did not violate safety outright, was often allowed to continue until higher command noticed, sometimes long after the tactical moment had passed. The Willys Jeep embodied this mindset: light, ubiquitous, and mechanically simple. The Jeep was used for far more than transport. Cruise-mounted machine guns, radios, stretchers, and occasionally weapons never intended for such a frame. These were not factory conversions. They were solutions born in motor pools and hedgerows, shaped by need rather than blueprint. By late, necessity was everywhere. German counterattacks, most notably in the Ardennes, forced American units to cover wide fronts with limited assets. Anti-tank capability mattered not only for stopping armor, but for projecting threat. A road that appeared defended slowed an enemy even if no shot was fired. A position that looked dangerous forced caution. This was understood instinctively by frontline soldiers. They knew that German forces relied heavily on reconnaissance and pattern recognition. A familiar silhouette prompted a familiar response. An unfamiliar one did not. And, in war, uncertainty often proved more powerful than fire. Improvised mounting of heavier weapons on light vehicles was not common, but it was not unheard of. In North Africa and Italy, U.S. units had experimented with mounting anti-tank guns on trucks or half-tracks when proper platforms were unavailable. These solutions were imperfect, often unstable, and never meant for prolonged use. But they had one advantage. They looked wrong, and wrong things on a battlefield demanded explanation. In December 1944, American units facing German forces understood that time mattered more than elegance. If a weapon could be brought forward quickly, if it could be seen, might alter enemy behavior long enough to shape the engagement. This is the environment in which the Jeep, with a tank-grade gun, appeared. Not as a joke, not as bravado, but as a calculated risk born from scarcity. Those who built it did not expect it to duel tanks. They expected it to be seen, to be noticed, to raise questions on the other side of the line, And those questions mattered deeply to an enemy whose doctrine, intelligence, culture, and recent experience had taught them to fear deception more than they feared small guns. To understand why, German forces reacted with such caution to something that should have been absurd, we must now turn to their side of the line, to the doctrine and assumptions that governed how they interpreted the battlefield. By late 1944, German forces on the Western Front were no longer fighting with confidence. They were fighting with suspicion. Years of Allied deception had reshaped how German commanders interpreted the battlefield. From the earliest campaigns in North Africa to the elaborate misdirection preceding the Normandy landings, German intelligence had learned painfully that what the enemy showed was often not what the enemy intended. This lesson cut deep. Operations like the Normandy deception plan had convinced German high command that the Allies were capable of sustained, large-scale misdirection. Fake units, dummy vehicles, misleading radio traffic, and unexpected deployments had repeatedly drawn German forces into the wrong place at the wrong time. By 1944, this history shaped every tactical decision. German doctrine placed enormous emphasis on pattern recognition. Vehicles, unit compositions, and weapon silhouettes were studied, cataloged, and expected to appear in familiar combinations. A jeep meant liaison. A tank destroyer meant ambush. A heavy gun meant prepared position. When those patterns aligned, decisions were quick. When they did not, hesitation followed. The late war battlefield intensified this tendency. German units were under strength, poorly supplied, and often isolated. Commanders could not afford costly mistakes. Engaging what looked like bait could draw precious armor or infantry into an ambush. They could not escape. This made novelty dangerous. An Allied vehicle carrying a weapon it should not carry triggered alarm precisely because it suggested intent. The Germans did not assume incompetence. They assumed deception. If the Allies were willing to expose a valuable gun on a flimsy platform, there must be something else supporting it. Infantry unseen, armor masked, artillery registered. The jeep-mounted cannon violated multiple German assumptions at once. It contradicted Allied logistical logic. It ignored principles of vehicle protection. It placed a valuable asset where doctrine said it did not belong. That combination was unsettling. German reconnaissance. Elements observing such a vehicle would not immediately fire, not because they feared the jeep itself, but because they feared what firing might reveal. Engaging could expose their position. It could trigger a pre-planned response. It could invite counterfire from unseen guns. In this environment, delay was caution, and caution was survival. German reports from late 1944 repeatedly reference confusion caused by unexpected Allied weapon placements. These incidents did not always lead to disaster, but they slowed decision-making. Orders moved up the chain. Confirmation was sought. Opportunities passed. This erosion of decisiveness mattered. The German army had been built on speed of decision, off-track tactics, the ability of officers to act independently within intent. But by late 1944, independence was constrained by fear of misreading the battlefield. Acting too quickly risked falling into a trap. Acting too slowly risked losing ground. The jeep with a mounted gun appeared at exactly this moment of psychological strain. It did not need to fire to achieve effect. Its mere presence disrupted the enemy's mental map. It forced German observers to ask questions that could not be answered quickly. What unit does this belong to? Why is it here? What is supporting it? And while those questions were asked, American forces gained something: precious time to reposition, time to prepare, time to decide the engagement on their own terms. This was not a victory of firepower. It was a victory of perception, and perception, in late war Europe, was often the most fragile and most decisive element of all. With this context in place, we can now examine the encounter itself through the angles that defined it: the men who built and crewed the weapon, the technical improbability of what they had created, and the enemy reaction that turned uncertainty into advantage. Human angle. the men who built what doctrine didn't allow. Decision to mount a heavy gun on a Jeep did not come from an engineer's desk or a staff officer's briefing. It came from soldiers who were short on options and long on responsibility. They were not trying to innovate. They were trying to cover a road. In late 1944, American infantry units often found themselves holding extended sectors with limited anti-tank support. Tank destroyers were elsewhere. Towed guns were slow. Armor was precious. What they had were Jeeps, spare weapons, and time measured in hours, not days. The men involved understood the risks immediately. A Jeep offered no protection. Recoil would be brutal. Stability would be poor. Escape would be difficult. But they also understood something else. Visibility. A gun that could be seen was sometimes more valuable than a gun that could fire. They stripped weight where they could. They reinforced mounting points with scavenged steel and wood. They accepted that the weapon would not fire accurately on the move and might only fire once before needing repositioning. This was not a mobile tank destroyer. It was a statement. The crew knew their job was not to win a duel. It was to make the enemy stop and think. That required discipline. The Jeep had to appear deliberately placed, not abandoned. The crew waited. They did not fidget. They did not move unless necessary. They understood that hesitation on the other side depended on confidence on theirs. This was not bravado. It was restraint, technological angle. Why the mounting shouldn't have worked from a technical standpoint. The setup made little. Since the Willys Jeep was never designed to absorb the recoil forces of a tank-grade cannon, its suspension was light, its frame flexible, its center of gravity low and narrow. Even mounting a heavy machine gun required reinforcement. Cannon multiplied those stresses. Recoil risked cracking the frame or flipping the vehicle. Cannon C was compromised by vibration and lack of traverse control. Ammunition handling was awkward. Reloading exposed the crew completely. In other words, the weapon violated nearly every principle of vehicle-mounted gunnery, which was exactly why it worked. Psychologically, German intelligence officers were trained to assume that Allied weapons followed logical deployment rules. Valuable assets were protected. Heavy guns had crews, cover, and supporting fires. When those assumptions were broken, it suggested intentional deception, not improvisation. The technical implausibility of the setup made it more convincing as bait. It looked too wrong to be. Accidental. Enemy. Angle. Why the Germans read it as a trap from the German perspective. The sight triggered a cascade of warnings. A Jeep with a heavy gun made no sense unless something else was present. Infantry hidden in the hedgerows. Armor massed behind the road bend. Artillery pre-registered on likely approach routes. Any of these were possible and all had been encountered before. German doctrine emphasized caution in the face of uncertainty. By late 1944, that caution bordered on paralysis. Losses could not be replaced. Vehicles could not be risked lightly. Commanders were punished more harshly for recklessness than for delay. So they waited. Forward observers reported the contact. Upward, orders were requested. Confirmation was sought. The Jeep remained in view, unmoving. Its barrel pointed down the road as if daring someone to test it. No test came. What the Germans feared was not the gun's power. It was what firing first might trigger. An ambush, a counterattack, collapse of an already thin defensive line. In that moment, the Americans achieved something rare without firing a shot. They seized the initiative. These three angles: human restraint, technical improbability, and enemy misinterpretation combined into a single effect: hesitation. And on a battlefield where minutes decided whether positions held or fell, hesitation was decisive. But hesitation alone does not change outcomes unless it is exploited. The next angles will show how that pause altered movement on the ground. Fear of deception reshaped German decision-making, and how doctrine itself began to fail when confronted with something it could not categorize. Tactical angle. How hesitation reshaped the ground fight. The immediate tactical effect was not destruction. It was delay. German elements that would normally probe a road with infantry or rush it with armor did neither. Movement slowed to a crawl. Scouts advanced in half steps, stopping to observe, then stopping again. Vehicles remained under cover, longer than doctrine preferred. Radios crackled with questions rather than commands. That pause mattered. American units behind the improvised position used the time to do what they could not have done under pressure. Infantry dug in deeper along the hedgerows, mines were repositioned. Artillery observers refined ranges. A road that had been opened 10 minutes earlier became layered with risk. None of this required the Jeep to fire. Its presence alone bought the minutes necessary to turn uncertainty into advantage. The Americans did not overplay it. They did not advance. They did not redeploy the vehicle theatrically. They let it sit, letting the enemy's caution do the work. By the time German commanders were ready to commit, if they were ready at all, the situation had changed. What it looked like, a curious anomaly at first, now appeared embedded in a broader defensive posture. The cost of testing it had risen tactically. The Jeep functioned as a fixing element. It pinned attention, it slowed tempo, it reshaped movement without exchanging fire. Psychological angle. Why novelty became fear. Late war German forces lived under constant informational stress. They were outnumbered, outproduced, outpaced, and they were acutely aware that Allied deception had worked before spectacularly. This bred a mindset where novelty equaled danger. The Jeep-mounted cannon exploited that mindset perfectly. It did not fit any known category. It was not a decoy in the obvious sense. It was too real, too solid, but it was also too wrong to be random. That ambiguity gnawed at decision-makers. Psychologically, the Germans were trapped between two risks: engage and trigger a hidden trap, hesitate and concede initiative. In earlier phases of the war, they might have chosen aggression. By late 1944, with resources dwindling and replacements scarce, hesitation felt safer. The cost of a wrong decision was catastrophic. The cost of delay was merely pausinone, so they delayed. This is how fear operates in modern war, not as panic, but as overcalculation. Every option is weighed, every unknown magnified. Action becomes slower, heavier, burdened by doubt. The Americans sensed this even if they could not articulate it formally. They understood that the enemy was no longer confident enough to challenge the unexpected. That understanding shaped how they held the position and how long they let the illusion work. Doctrinal angle. When rules stop explaining reality, doctrine exists to simplify chaos. German doctrine taught officers what to expect and how to respond. It worked best when the enemy followed recognizable patterns. Tanks appeared with infantry. Guns appeared with cover. Vehicles behaved as designed. The Jeep-mounted cannon broke that grammar. It forced German doctrine into a corner where no rule applied cleanly. If it was a real weapon, it was irrationally deployed. If it was bait, it was dangerously effective. Either interpretation undermined the doctrinal response. This is where doctrine fails, not when it is wrong, but when it cannot classify what it sees. American doctrine, by contrast, tolerated Massenz's. It allowed for expedient solutions and local judgment. The Jeep was never meant to be doctrinally correct, only needed to function long enough to shape behavior. That difference mattered. While German officers searched for the right response, American units acted on the assumption that there was no right response, only timely ones. The Jeep's crew did not need to know how the enemy would react. They only needed to know that the enemy would not react quickly. That assumption proved correct. In this sense, the encounter was not a clash of weapons, but a clash of mental models. One side tried to interpret, the other side exploited the delay inherent in interpretation. As the standoff stretched on, the Americans recognized the effect they were having. They did not escalate. They did not reveal support. They let the moment mature. Eventually, German forces adjusted by rerouting, pulling back, or choosing a different axis. The road in question remained uncontested, longer than expected. The improvised weapon achieved its purpose without firing. This convergence of tactics, psychology, and doctrine created the turning point of the encounter, marked by an explosion, but by a decision not taken, and that decision, born of uncertainty, would soon force a larger shift on the ground, one that revealed just how powerful perception could be when it arrived, wrapped in something the enemy could not explain. The turning point did not announce itself with noise. It arrived in stillness. on the frozen road. The Jeep remained exactly where it had been, left engine off, silhouettes sharp against the fog. The gun barrel did not move. No infantry revealed themselves. No artillery fell. The Americans did nothing to reassure the enemy that what they were seeing was harmless. German forward elements waited for the mistake. None came. Minutes passed. Then more. Radio traffic increased, but movement did not. Orders were requested, clarified, reconsidered. The longer the Jeep remained unchallenged, the more dangerous it appeared. A trap left untouched for this long felt deliberate. From the German perspective, the situation had inverted. Normally, hesitation favored the defender. Here, hesitation favored the side that had created uncertainty. The Americans were gaining time without exposing themselves. The Germans were spending time trying to resolve a problem that refused to resolve. Small adjustments began. Infantry patrols were pulled back slightly, vehicles repositioned under cover. Heavy weapons that might have tested the position were held in reserve, waiting for confirmation that never came. The road, once a potential axis of advance, became a liability. The Jeep had done its work. Only then did the Americans recognize the full effect. Observers behind the hedgerows saw German movement slow, then divert. The enemy was no longer preparing to advance. They were preparing to avoid. This was the decisive shift. The weapon had not fired. It had not destroyed anything. Yet it had altered the enemy's plan at the local level. A route closed. A timetable slipped. Pressure eased where it had been building. The Jeep crew remained disciplined. They did not celebrate. They did not reposition dramatically. They waited for the moment when staying became riskier than leaving. That moment came. Quietly, German elements began rerouting their movement along parallel roads. The axis that mattered was abandoned without a fight. Whatever the Germans believed, they had seen. They decided it was not worth challenging. Only after that decision did the Americans withdraw the vehicle. They did so deliberately and without haste, moving it out of sight before curiosity could turn into aggression. The gun was never tested in direct fire. It did not need to be. The climax of the encounter lay in what did not happen. No shot, no charge, no ambush sprung. The Germans had chosen caution over action, and that choice reshaped the engagement entirely. What had begun as an improvised solution to a shortage became a psychological lever, one that worked precisely because it looked intentional. But hesitation alone does not end a story. The consequences of that choice, how it affected German movement, American confidence, and the understanding of improvisation on the battlefield would become clear only afterward, when reports filtered in and the meaning of the moment could be seen in context. To reach that understanding, we must follow the engagement into its second decisive phase, where the absence of action forced action elsewhere, and the battlefield adjusted around a weapon that never fired. The decision not to engage set events in motion that could not be reversed quickly. Once German commanders began rerouting movement away from the road, the battlefield reshaped itself organically. Orders filtered down not as alarms, but as adjustments. Units were told to hold. Patrols were redirected. Vehicles were instructed to seek alternate routes that were narrower, longer, and less favorable. This was not a retreat. It was a concession. The Jeep with the mounted gun had created a point of resistance where none should have existed. By declining to test it, the Germans allowed that illusion to harden into fact. The road was now treated as defended, regardless of how thin that defense actually was. American units exploited the shift. Immediately, infantry advanced cautiously into positions that had been contested hours earlier. Engineers improved obstacles. Observation posts were established where fire had been expected. What had been a temporary pause became a localized advantage. Built quietly on time, gained without bloodshed. From the German side, reports began to reflect uncertainty rather than threat. Mentions of unusual weapon placement, references to possible anti-tank ambush, recommendations to avoid direct approach until further intelligence could be gathered. No one wanted to be responsible for ordering an advance that triggered disaster. The Jeep was never mentioned as decisive. It was simply listed as part of an environment that no longer felt safe to probe. That distinction mattered because environments linger longer in memory than specific objects. For the Americans, the effect was instructive. The men who had mounted the gun did not interpret the outcome as proof that the setup was tactically sound in a conventional sense. They understood its limits clearly. What they recognized instead was the value of disruption. The Jeep had disrupted the enemy's decision cycle. It forced observation where action was expected. It forced interpretation where instinct would normally operate. That delay allowed American forces to shape the ground without interference. This realization did not lead to widespread replication. No manual was rewritten. No production line changed. The setup remained what it had always been, an improvisation suited to a narrow moment. But the lesson stayed. Late war American units increasingly understood that perception could be weaponized. Unexpected placements, unconventional silhouettes, and deliberate stillness could achieve effects disproportionate to their actual combat power. The Germans, for their part, withdrew from the area without fully understanding why they had done so. They had followed doctrine. They had avoided risk. They had preserved forces. Yet ground had been lost all the same. That paradox, losing without fighting, would appear again and again in the final months of the war. The Jeep with the mounted cannon did not win a battle. It did not destroy a unit, but it changed the behavior of the enemy at a critical moment, and that change had consequences beyond the immediate road. By the time the Americans removed the weapon and resumed normal movement, the moment had passed. The illusion no longer needed to be maintained. The road was no longer contested. The turning point had already done its work, and as the engagement faded into reports and memory, its significance lay not in firepower, but in the realization that modern battlefields were governed as much by expectation as by force. That realization would shape how the incident was understood afterward, how it was reported, how it was remembered, and why it never became doctrine despite its success. Those consequences, subtle and uncelebrated, belong to what followed when the moment passed. It left very little behind. There was no wreckage on the road, no crater to mark a strike, no burned vehicle to photograph. The Jeep was removed quietly, its gun dismounted, and returned to more conventional use. The road, once avoided, became simply another stretch of ground reclaimed without ceremony. In the official record, the incident barely registered. After-action reports from the sector spoke in familiar terms. Nomeo movement slowed. Axis of advance. Altered ground secured with minimal contact. There was no category for hesitation induced by an improvised silhouette. There was no checkbox for enemy declined. Engagement due to uncertainty. So the moment dissolved into phrasing that hid its cause. From the American perspective, the result was tangible, even if the method was not. Units gained time. Positions were improved. A potential point of friction disappeared without a fight. In a winter defined by attrition and exhaustion, that mattered for the soldiers involved. The outcome confirmed something they already sensed. The battlefield was no longer governed solely by weapons and numbers. It was governed by interpretation. What the enemy believed they were seeing shaped what they dared to do next. The men who had built the Jeep-mounted gun did not claim credit. They understood how easily the outcome could have reversed. Had the Germans fired immediately, the vehicle would likely have been destroyed in seconds. The success depended entirely on the enemy choosing caution. That choice was not guaranteed. It was contextual. The Germans were tired. Their units were thin. Their intelligence culture was shaped by years of Allied deception. Under those conditions, novelty felt dangerous. The Jeep exploited that feeling perfectly. German reports from the period show repeated references to unexpected American deployments causing delays or redirection. These were not dramatic failures, but cumulative ones. Each delay eroded tempo. Each rerouting ceded initiative. The Jeep incident fit that pattern. It was not decisive alone, but it contributed to a broader environment where German commanders increasingly chose avoidance over engagement when confronted with uncertainty. This had strategic consequences as the front moved eastward. The Germans lost not just territory, but the ability to shape events. They reacted rather than acted. Roads closed before being tested. Positions were abandoned before being assaulted. The war narrowed into a series of concessions, reinforced not by firepower, but by fear of what might be waiting unseen. For American units, this reinforced a quiet lesson. Not every advantage must be loud. Sometimes the most effective action was to present the enemy with a problem they could not solve quickly and then wait. That understanding would carry forward into later engagements, not as a tactic to be codified, but as an instinct to be applied when opportunity allowed. The aftermath of the Jeep-mounted gun was therefore not a lesson written down, but one absorbed subtly, informally, and permanently. And it would shape how the episode was remembered in hindsight, not as an example of battlefield ingenuity meant to be copied, but as a demonstration of how fragile enemy confidence had become. By the final months of the war, that fragility would become even clearer when viewed against the larger arc of events that followed. The Jeep-mounted cannon never became a standard solution. It could not. American commanders understood immediately why the incident resisted formalization. The weapon was exposed, the platform fragile. The effect depended entirely on enemy psychology, not on mechanical advantage. In a different context, against a confident or desperate opponent, the Jeep would have been destroyed without hesitation. Doctrine cannot rely on uncertainty. It must rely on repeatable outcomes. For that reason, the episode remained what it had always been: a local improvisation, suited to a narrow window of conditions that existed briefly in late 1944. As American logistics recovered and armor availability improved, the need for such expedients faded. Proper anti-tank assets returned to the front. The Jeep went back to carrying men and messages. Yet the meaning of the moment did not disappear. What the incident revealed was not a new weapon, but a change in the character of the war. German forces were no longer operating from a position of initiative. They were interpreting, not shaping. Every unfamiliar sight carried the weight of past deception and present weakness. This was new. Earlier in the war, German units would have tested the position aggressively. They would have probed with infantry, fired artillery, forced clarity through action. By late 1944, that confidence had eroded. Losses could not be replaced. Mistakes were fatal. Caution became doctrine in practice, even when doctrine preached boldness. The Jeep exploited that gap between written doctrine and lived reality. It did so quietly. No medals were awarded for it, no commendations written. The men involved moved on to the next problem, the next road, the next night in the cold. The episode survived only as a story passed along, an example of how the enemy could sometimes be defeated without being fought in aggregate. Moments like this mattered. The final months of the war in Europe were defined by momentum. German units fell back not always because they were destroyed, but because they could no longer contest every approach. They chose where to stand and where to yield. Every hesitation accelerated that process. American forces advanced not just through strength, but through pressure, constant, unrelenting, and often indirect. The Jeep-mounted gun was one small expression of that pressure. It suggested danger where little existed, and in doing so, made danger real elsewhere. Post-war histories would focus on battles, not pauses, on firepower, not doubt. But those who had been there understood that doubt had become one of the Allies' most reliable allies by the time the war ended. The Germans had learned to fear not just American weapons, but American unpredictability, the willingness to improvise, to violate expectations, to present problems without obvious answers. The Jeep incident did not teach that lesson, it merely reflected it. And that reflection, brief, fragile, and easily missed, helps explain why. The final advance across Europe moved faster than anyone had dared to predict, because the enemy was no longer sure what he was looking at. And in war, uncertainty is often the beginning of defeat. War is often remembered as a contest of force, of armor against armor, of guns against guns. But beneath that violence lies something less visible and just as decisive: the struggle to understand what the enemy intends before it is too late. The Jeep with the mounted cannon did not win a battle. It did not destroy a tank. It did not even fire a shot. What it did was far more subtle. It broke expectation by appearing where it should not have been, carrying a weapon it should not have carried. It forced the enemy to hesitate, and in late 1944, hesitation was a luxury German forces could no longer afford. This is the quiet truth of modern warfare. Victory does not always belong to the side with the most power, but to the side that controls the enemy's decision-making. The Americans did not need the Jeep to be strong. They needed it to be confusing. Confusion slows action. Slowed action seeds initiative, and initiative, once lost, is rarely regained. The soldiers who built that vehicle understood none of this in theoretical terms. They were not practicing psychological warfare. They were solving an immediate problem with the materials at hand. Yet their solution worked precisely because it aligned with a deeper shift already underway: the collapse of German confidence in its own interpretations. By the end of the war, the Allies would field overwhelming force. But before that force arrived everywhere at once, moments like this smoothed its path. Roads were abandoned, positions avoided, decisions delayed until delay itself became defeat. The Jeep rolled away unnoticed. The road stayed open, and the war moved on. In the end, that is often how history turns, not on dramatic breakthroughs, but on small acts that change how the enemy sees the field in front of him. Not every victory is loud. Some arrive quietly, mounted on four wheels, carrying a gun that looks wrong and therefore makes the enemy stop, look again, and choose not to move at all.